Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us for this webinar this morning. My name is Chris Israel. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance for U.S. Startups and Inventors for Jobs, and I really appreciate the opportunity to moderate this panel discussion focused on the myths and realities of pharmaceutical patents. We're joined by two great experts today, Mark Schultz, who is the Goodyear Endowed Chair at the University of Akron School of Law and Faculty Director of the IP Policy Institute, and his colleague, Emily Michiko Morris, who is the David L. Brennan Endowed Chair at the University of Akron School of Law and Associate Faculty Chair and Senior Fellow for Life Sciences at the IP Policy Institute. They have combined their great expertise to produce a series of new research, a lot of which we'll explore today, and all of which can be found at unpackingip.org. So all one word, unpackingip.org. Indeed, a lot to unpack, so let's dive right in this morning. Again, we really appreciate folks taking the time to join us today, especially because this topic, patenting activity in the U.S. pharmaceutical sector, is not really for the faint of heart. It's a very complex and difficult industry. It's notable for very long lead time for commercialization, huge R&D costs, a very difficult regulatory environment, all of which is set against the backdrop of the U.S. patent system, and that's what we'll focus a lot on today, which in and of itself is a complex and complicated architecture and legal infrastructure. And then you layer in the political pressure to deliver effective, safe, and affordable products to U.S. patients. And we'll talk a little bit about this with maybe an additional level of complexity, the need for the U.S. To really lead in this sector. You know, we have to lead, we have to compete, and it's a very difficult global environment. So again, there's a lot to get to, and as we work our way through a more detailed analysis of some legislative proposals and some of the myths and the terms and the phrases that are out there. Maybe we can start by asking Mark and Emily to start with a bit of a level set. Our focus today is on separating myths from reality when it comes to pharmaceutical patents, and this has obviously become a big topic in a lot of healthcare policy debates. So right along those lines, House Judiciary IP Subcommittee had a hearing a couple of weeks ago focused on medicines and IP. On that issue, when it came up, a lot of members of the committee and some critics, witnesses at the committee, expressed concern about the number of patents on drugs. They claim that there's large numbers of patents on drugs, and this can be a delay or a hindrance to generic and biosimilar competition. What struck you as you both watched that hearing and studied it closely as you looked at the disconnect between the data and the research you've done and the way that those issues were laid out and discussed in the hearing? Take us through some of the reality that maybe underlies what came up as criticisms and claims at that hearing.
So thanks, Chris, and we really appreciate a chance to talk about our research. And one of the things I worry about is that we take our leadership in the U.S., our leadership in biopharma as a given, and that drug development is we take that for granted. The challenge of developing innovative drugs that we all want and need, and the U.S. has only been a leader in this sector for 35, 40 years. Europe led for centuries, and so we should never take that leadership for granted. There's a lot of competition, and it's really important to get the policies right. And I think in terms of taking things for granted, I think there's a misunderstanding of how drug development works, the role that patents play in it. So in our research, we've had the chance to interview scientists from pharma companies, some of their strategists and chief patent counsel. And what we've found is that drug development is very much a science-driven process characterized by risk. So I really want folks to keep in mind that over 90% of drug candidates fail because the science doesn't work out to make them safe and effective. And yet, the way many portray drug development process, including witnesses at that hearing 2 weeks ago, is that it's simple, that a group of patent lawyers and business people sit down in a conference room, decide what, how, and when to develop drugs, and then tell the scientists what to do. And that couldn't be further from the truth. As one patent lawyer put it to us, the scientists drive the car while the patent lawyers are in the passenger seat along for the ride, making sure that they secure the investment that's been made in the science that candidly usually doesn't work out. We've been told that many pharma scientists can spend decades at a pharma company and retire never having worked on a drug that reaches patients. So this is a really difficult process.
Yeah, and Chris, I'll just second what Mark said and emphasize how important patent protections are for the biopharmaceutical industry. And in fact, you asked just about anybody, the biopharmaceutical industry is the one technology in which we think the patent system really does work and really provides meaningful incentives. And as Mark said, people are concerned about drug prices. You mentioned this as well, but that's not a phenomenon that's unique to biopharmaceuticals. We see this with healthcare costs in the United States more generally. So to focus just on biopharmaceuticals and even more specifically biopharmaceutical patents really is missing the bigger picture and could miss some much larger issues. And I think one of the disconnects too that we see is we've heard a lot of discussion recently about drug prices in the United States versus drug prices elsewhere. And Mark mentioned that Europe used to be the leader in drug innovation. But I think it's tempting to try to compare drug prices and drug patenting in the United States with other countries. But what we have here is very different than what they have in other countries. Other countries, they have price controls that we don't have here. In other countries, even though the patent systems are similar, the patent laws are still very different. And so the patenting patterns that we see in other countries are different. But more importantly, people should realize too that of the truly new drugs, that are introduced, they're almost always introduced into the United States first. And that a lot of these other countries that have drug price controls or other means of trying to control prices often have to wait for years before they see some of the new drugs that patients here in the United States enjoy early on. And so there are a lot of things that go into drug pricing, but also go into competition from generics and biosimilars in the drug market.
Yeah. No, and we hear that a lot. Maybe Emily, you know, keeping with the theme of unpacking, maybe could you unpack that last point you made a little bit more? I mean, you mentioned the price controls and some of the other deterrents to innovation in other countries. I think those are kind of the most favored nation construct, and I think USTR is on the brink of looking into that maybe a little more closely, and a lot of people call that out. Are there other factors or features in the United States that lead to this concentration of innovation being here, whether it's, the investment capabilities, venture flow, university systems? I mean, are there other things that we need to note and protect and treat as precious here in the US that support the fact that the United States is the global leader in innovation in these life science categories?
Well, I think one of the biggest changes that we saw 35, 40 years ago that Mark mentioned was what's called the Bayh-Dole Act, in which we have a lot of research, very basic research that's funded by the government, by the NIH. And up until the 1980s, people who did this kind of research could not patent that research because it was funded by the government. But what happened is that so much of that research just sat on the shelf, right? No one in private industry wanted to take up that research and develop it into usable products that would really help patients and help others in the United States. But the Bayh-Dole Act changed that specifically so that private industry would be willing to invest in that basic research, that embryonic research, in life sciences and other areas and develop it into usable products. And it's really that development process that often is the riskiest, often is quite difficult, and almost always is much more expensive than the original discoveries that might go on in the lab. And so I think that's part of the reason why the United States really started to take the lead in biopharmaceutical research and development.
Yeah.
Yeah, we turned our universities into engines of innovation, and the rest of the world has envied our model and tried to emulate it. But historically, in recent decades, the U.S. has invested, the government has invested more in basic research than others. And historically, we've had a more friendly commercial environment with both the patent system and with regard to reimbursement policies that really encouraged a robust development of innovative drugs and led to the explosion of the biotech industry here and so many other beneficial developments that have helped patients.
So leading off of that and maybe going back into a little bit more of a granular question, kind of specific to some policy considerations. As you say, Mark, there's been this explosion in innovation, Emily, like Vidal, the research development, there's an infusion of venture capital and a lot of other things. So it shouldn't probably surprise anyone that there's been a corresponding growth in the number of patents, particularly in all industries, but if we're looking only at life sciences. And that's actually turned into a criticism, which seems kind of counterintuitive. And it's come up that kind of framing the question, are there actually, there's this criticism, there's a lot of patents on drugs and maybe too many, and policymakers trying to figure out, is there an appropriate, there's always a dangerous game of, government providing the solution, but, maybe what is the right amount of patents on a drug or product? So I got just the threshold question, to you both, are there actually do you see a lot of patents associated with drugs in particular? And do the number of patents that are assigned to a particular product, and all these they're not to the product, they're to the invention. So that's an important distinction. But does that actually have any effect on the trajectory of generics or biosimilars becoming available in the marketplace, that, the number of patents, so to speak, around a particular invention or product?
Sure. So this has been the topic of a lot of, I guess, what purports to be empirical research from both, I guess, NGOs and campaigning organizations like IMAC, as well as scholars. And what we found is that a lot of this research by both advocates and scholars doesn't really go far enough and uses dubious methodologies. They rely on counting patents. And then they rely on the power of impressive large numbers to imply or draw conclusions. They come up with big numbers, and they seem to be running up the score quite often. From what we can tell, sometimes their methods are opaque, but they're counting things like patent applications and abandoned patent applications and have dubious ways of saying that a particular patent is associated with the medicine. But more than that, when we look at the actual data, there have been peer-reviewed studies that show things like the following. If we look at small molecule drugs, small molecule drugs are the drugs that we've traditionally, used that come in pill or capsule form as opposed to the more complex biologics. But those drugs in the U.S. to get approved by the FDA, the innovators have to submit an application to the FDA. Once it gets approved, it's listed in a database that's popularly called the Orange Book. And when an innovator gets a patent listed in the Orange Book, gets a drug listed in the Orange Book, a new drug, they have to volunteer what patents are associated with it. So that gives us a chance, that gives researchers a chance to do serious empirical research. And when we look at the Orange Book and we look at the patents in the Orange Book, here's some things we found. Or here are some things scholars have found, like Darrow and Mai in 2022, they found that over 60% of the drugs listed in the Orange Book no longer had patents listed. The patents had all expired, which isn't
Mm.
surprising. 90% of prescriptions in the US are filled by generics. We have a really robust generic market, so actually one of the most, really the most robust in the world. Of the 39% of the remaining drugs that still had patents in effect, the majority had four or fewer patents. So much for that power of impressive numbers. When we look at biologics are more modern treatments that are rather complex. They require, the cycle of innovation with regard to biologics requires, biologics are larger molecules, they're complex, they can do a lot of things. We often we see cancer therapies like CAR-T therapy, mRNA vaccines. These take innovation from the very beginning, from how they are created, the platform of technology, to the specific treatment, to manufacturing. So there tend to be more patents because unlike small molecule drugs, which are pills, which we've known how to synthesize for, well over 100 years, and we've known how to manufacture well for decades, these require more innovation. And even there, we only see an average of 17 patents asserted in biosimilar cases for litigation regarding biologics. So even there, it's not a large
Mm.
number. And so what we're seeing is that the numbers tend to be inflated. And finally, let me just conclude this by putting some context on this. So the IP Owners Organization, IPO, does a scorecard every year. Well, who are the top 300 companies receiving patents? Because they actually think, it deserves a scorecard, that it's something to brag about. Out of those top 300, only seven were biopharma companies. And those seven combined only received about a third as many patents as the leading patentee, Samsung. And although patents are so important to this industry, they actually receive fewer, biopharma companies receive fewer patents per research dollar than other companies. Only 1/10 the number of patents per R&D dollar spent as opposed to software and tech companies. So over and over, we see these claims that biopharma companies patent excessively, and yet they're not the top patentees. You would think they were, but they are actually rather, parsimonious with regard to how many patents they get. And I'll turn it over to Emily to tell us a little more about what the connection is between patenting and generic and biosimilar entry.
Yeah, so Chris, to return to your question about the effect of the number of patents, and again, Mark's absolutely right. We see so many studies focusing solely on the number of patents. The
Yeah.
research that I and others have done show that there really is no correlation, much less a causative relationship between the number of patents on a drug and when a generic or biosimilar competitor might enter the market. So the USPTO itself did a study back in 2024 of about 25 drugs. They found no correlation between the number of patents on those drugs and when generics or biosimilars for those drugs entered the market. I and my colleague Joshua Kresh have done a much larger study of about 131 small molecule drugs. Again, we found no correlation and certainly no causative relationship between the number of drugs on a particular drug product and when a generic might enter the market. And in fact, if you look at the data, um, the market exclusivity, the time between when a new drug enters the market and when a generic version, a generic competitor for that drug enters the market, it has consistently remained around 12 to 14 years for decades. And so if companies were really trying to increase the number of patents that they have on their drug products as a way of trying to deter generic or biosimilar market entry, apparently it's not working very well because it really has stayed very consistent in terms of how long they remain on the market before a generic competitor enters the market. And similarly, if you look at biologics, right, there was a study last year, I believe, that was done that said that 62 biologics that are not covered by patents still have no biosimilars. So no patents, but still no biosimilars. And then looking forward, of the 118 or so biologics that are due to lose patent exclusivity in the next year or so, over 90% do not appear to have any kind of biosimilar competition in the works in the near future. And so patents really don't seem, or at least the number of patents don't really seem to be the key issue. And so really what you need to look at is what patents are we talking about? Some patents can deter market entry, but other patents really can't. And so you need to be looking at the quality of these patents, what they're covering, and not just the number of patents. Again, the factors that influence generic or biosimilar market entry are much more complex than simply the number of patents on a drug.
Can you just double click on that maybe for a minute, Emily? You mentioned the 62 biosimilars that have no patents attached, or 62 uh, bioproducts that don't have patents attached to them, but there's no biosimilars. Is that, and so if it's not a patent problem, just kind of laying the groundwork for that. 17 on average attached to bio products, as Mark noted. What are the key issues? Is that just is it a complexity problem for the biosimilars? Is it a manufacturing problem? Is it capital? I mean, what are the non-patent challenges? I guess if we're trying to put data forward to say, patents are not not the barrier that people portraying them to be. What are some of those barriers, and maybe how should policymakers be thinking about attacking that problem if we can all agree that we should, leave the patent system alone in that equation?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially when it comes to biologics and biosimilars. Biologics, as Mark mentioned, are much more complex. They're much more unpredictable. At this point in time, we have to use living tissues or living cells to manufacture biologics. So exactly as you pointed out, manufacturing them in a consistent and large scale fashion is really difficult. And in fact, that's kind of baked into the statute, the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act, in that unlike small molecule drugs, where if you want to manufacture a generic version, you have to show that it's basically identical to the reference list drug. For biologics, you don't even have to show that they're identical. They just have to be similar, right? Hence the name biosimilars. But even achieving that kind of similarity is difficult. And so a lot of what we see are exactly as you suggest, technological difficulties in trying to develop these biosimilars. And so what happens with a lot of these biosimilars when they go on the market, they're not that much less expensive than their reference biologics. Certainly not the price differential that we see between a reference small molecule drug and a generic version of it, for exactly the reasons that you mentioned.
Yeah, it's hard. It's very complicated. You have zero margin for error, right? I mean, you mentioned, Mark, consumer electronics products and technology products that have, massive patent portfolios attached to them. I want to maybe dig into that a little bit with you, and this idea of incremental innovation, or kind of building on the kind of core base product that's in the marketplace. It seems like in most technical industries, from autos to semiconductors to AI, where we see a new and improved frontier model come out every couple of weeks. Companies are continue to improve their products after launch. It's expected and applauded in most instances, right? Yet in pharmaceuticals, we seem to see this criticism of post innovation or post approval innovation, and kind of expanding and growing, making the product better over time. As you study the sector, I mean, what do you see? What's the role of post-approval innovation in biopharmaceuticals? How critical is it to just the growth and natural progression of the industry? And how should again, keep coming back to this, how should policymakers in an ideal world be looking at that type of growth and expansion of innovation in this sector?
It's so essential. And, we celebrate it when it comes to our phones, which, this one I'm waving around is now a couple generations old because it's a couple of years old. But every year they improve them, right? And we're not shocked or appalled. We don't feel cheated as consumers. People stand in line to buy the new iPhone every year. Um, I think there's a little bit of if I can be professorial for a moment, there's a little bit of a problem with how we understand what drugs are. It seems to be simple, right? We look at a pill, a capsule, or even an injectable, and we think, well, that's the drug. Um, And actually, that is in a sense, a colloquial sense, sure, that's the drug, but that's not what how things work. People think, but they tend to think, oh, there's a drug, that's a pill, there's a patent on it. I get that. You don't really get it if you think that the pill is just one patented invention. What drugs are really typically bundles of invention, no different from this iPhone. I think we get that when you look at an iPhone, there's a lot of inventions that went into that. You can kind of see that when the next year you have three lenses or four lenses on your camera as opposed to one lens. You're like, oh, they've added features. And you can understand that those features are patented. People don't see that with the drug because that innovation is hidden in a sense. But we get when you look at a drug is a bundle of inventions. Remember that 90% failure rate. Most drugs fail. So we get, the pharma company may begin to look at a promising molecule, for example, and say, oh, this could treat a disease condition. When they start to test it, what they may find is that the human body metabolizes it too quickly or not quickly enough, so it doesn't absorb quickly enough to deal with the disease, or maybe the body, when it metabolizes it, has toxic byproducts. Those things need to get fixed. And candidly, most of the time they don't get fixed because 90% of these candidate drugs fail. But in order to fix them, you often have to innovate more. You need to reformulate, you need to add other substances, you need to do something. And when those changes are innovative, they lead to further patents because they're new inventions. And at every step of the way, there are further inventions. So by the time they run that gauntlet of that 90% failure rate and get it through clinical trials and get a new drug product, what they've got is a bundle of inventions. So people should look at that pill and think of it as no less of a bundle of inventions than their iPhone, their car, or their computer.
So these are
So
brand
that's,
new. Just to
yeah,
walk through the kind of, I mean, this I'm dumbing it down a little bit, Mark, but just to kind of drive some additional clarity. I mean, those each time that new kind of inventive step happens, that's a brand new patent process, right? I mean,
yeah,
there's no such thing. You don't kind of, you know, it's not like patent A and patent or patent one and patent 1A or B, right? I mean, these are all brand new patent applications, right, that have to go through the exact same new process at PTO. I mean, just clarify how, I mean, these are completely distinct inventive
yeah,
steps, novel, meet all the criteria at the USPTO to be granted patent approval, right? Just, sequentially all along the
exactly.
way, right?
Yeah, every one of those patents requires the same kind of scrutiny, the same level of proof, and they don't hand out patents for things that aren't truly new. And so, yeah, they have to go through that every time, and then they have to satisfy the FDA to release the drug product. And so you've got a new drug product, yeah. And so the drug product is protected potentially by several patents. And I think the mistake people make when it comes to the pre-approval patenting, they sometimes say, "Oh, well, the company must have gamed that out. They could have done that all at once, but they waited 2, 3, 5 years to do these fixes and these reformulations." And somehow those patents illegitimately extend the life of exclusivity. And that's just silly, right? I said, if they could come up with all those solutions at once, they would. They want to bring drugs to market sooner rather than later. Not when you have a 90% failure rate, you don't mess around. You don't game the process. Because chances are the process is going to fail. So you do everything you can to make it work as soon as you can. Then I think you wanted me to address post-approval innovation. What happens after there's a drug product? Why do they then improve it? So, for example, we get a great example this past year, Keytruda, the really important innovative cancer drug. Historically, Merck delivered that drug as an intravenous drug. Now, sometimes I think we consumers, patients think of a needle as a needle, but not all delivery systems that use a needle are the same. Think of an IV bag. It's a big bag. You have it drip into your arm all day long or for hours. And it takes a long time to get that drug. And that's what Keytruda was initially. In the past year, Merck has developed, and then in the past year, it's been approved to have a subcutaneous version. A subcutaneous needle is just a tiny needle. It shoots the substance under your skin, and then it gets slowly absorbed. And the difference for patients in Keytruda, post-approved, this post-approval innovation is they no longer have to go to special infusion centers, sit there for a long time. And they can go to their doctor's office, get a quick shot, and this changes the access to the drug, the patient experience, and this has proved to be a meaningful innovation. Great. So if it's so great, why didn't Merck do it in the first place? Are they just playing a game to extend their exclusivity? That is what several activists have accused them of doing, as if this were simple. Well, guess what? Like, it's really hard to take something that is in a big IV bag, concentrate it into a small injectable, and have it absorbed by the body under the skin. It doesn't often work. That 90% failure rate also applies, that high failure rate also applies to those kind of innovations. And why are they delayed? They're not delayed. It's the science that takes a long time. These kind of improvements come when the science allows them. So what happens is innovators keep innovating. Once you have a drug that is proven safe and effective, you try to expand it to more patients. Two-thirds of cancer drugs are used for additional cancer treatments, new kinds of cancer treatments, which is really important. Um, but every one of those improvements requires innovation with a high failure rate. It's a potential innovation. It has to be tested. It has to get FDA approval. It creates a new drug product. And now when we're talking about the patent system, here's one key takeaway. Those improvements that are patented, they don't prevent copying the earlier version. When Merck's patents on intravenous Keytruda expire, competitors will be free to copy it. What they're going to have to wait to do is copy the subcutaneous version with later expiring patents. People use this really loose language. They say things like the newer patents extend the older patents. That's a legal impossibility, but people will say that to congressional staff. They'll testify
Yeah.
with that implication. It's just not true.
Yeah.
Yeah, just can't happen. So that new innovation is beneficial to patients and does not prevent copying, does not prevent generic or biosimilar competition for the older versions.
Yeah, and Chris, if I can just add to that, exactly what Mark said. Again, you can't just look quantitatively at the number of patents. You have to look qualitatively at what the patents are actually covering. And so, you see a lot of the critics saying, oh, well, you have a patent on the active ingredient, right? And you've got that patent, that should be enough, kind of this one and done proposal. You don't really need patents on any of the further inventions or innovations that follow after that active ingredient. And yet, two of my favorite examples, both of which have been criticized as using these additional patents, the so-called secondary patents, to try to deter generic market entry, are actually great examples of how difficult it can be, even once you've identified an active ingredient, to parlay that active ingredient into a usable drug. So, for example, omeprazole, which was pretty revolutionary when it first came out a couple of decades ago. Used to treat ulcers and gastric reflux. Ironically, when people swallow omeprazole, it gets dissolved by the gastric acid in your stomach before it can even enter your bloodstream. And so the people who worked on omeprazole had to spend years trying to figure out how to deliver the omeprazole, what kind of coating they needed to put on the omeprazole so that it could actually bypass the gastric acids in your stomach and eventually enter your bloodstream. The same thing with Myrbetriq. I think that was a drug that was mentioned at the hearing a couple of weeks ago that you mentioned. Part of the problem with Myrbetriq was that it was absorbed by food. But if you didn't eat food with it, then it would pass through your system too quickly and you wouldn't absorb it into the bloodstream. And so the people who worked on Myrbetriq had to work on a whole new series of inventions to try to get that balance perfect, right? We want the drug to stay in your system long enough to be absorbed, but not to be absorbed by the food. And so again, this one and done strategy really just ignores the complexity and difficulty of the underlying science. And then just one other thing that I'd really like to add, and this relates to the recent Supreme Court case between Hikma and Amarin, which was all about so-called skinny labels. I won't go into the technical details of that, but it all had to do with this post-approval research that Mark referred to, right? And in particular, the immense value of continuing to do research on drugs and continuing to identify new patient populations that might benefit from that drug. And those kinds of things are invaluable. We see that with the GLP-1 drugs, right? We first thought that GLP-1 drugs were great for helping people manage their diabetes. Turns out to be a great treatment for obesity. And now they're talking about using it perhaps to treat addiction and sleep apnea, even osteoarthritis, right? And you certainly want to incentivize companies to continue looking at their existing drugs and identifying these new indications for them. And there's actually reason to be concerned that companies do not have enough incentive to continue this kind of research because it turns out that even though you can get a method or you can get a patent on new methods of using existing drugs to treat new indications, those kinds of patents are effectively unenforceable because of the automatic substitution laws and policies that we have here in the United States, as well as off-label prescribing practices. So again, simply counting the patents misses a whole much
Yeah.
more complex picture.
Yeah. Um, yeah, well, I think we warned folks this discussion was not for the faint of heart. So we've got a lot of science on the table here this morning, and I think it's really important, I think, to talk through specific examples because although Emily, as you pointed out, and Mark, I mean, the science and the progression of these products from the lab to the patient is extraordinarily complex. And it but I think you do have to understand, yeah, maybe walk through these case studies to understand how the patent system does interact with specific products and specific kind of timelines with those products to really understand and take apart. And that's the problem with, saying, well, they're duplicative or it's the same or that, it's a very easy thing to say, or there's these patent thickets that have been assembled, you do a lot of research on this. So again, urge folks to unpackingip.org for a deep dive on this, right? But it takes a very complex answer to address very simplistic and unfair accusation or criticism. So I want to maybe pivot off that and let's talk a little bit about we've talked about the hearing, we've talked about some legislative, approaches to this. One is a bill called the Ethic Act that's been introduced in the House, which was the subject of the hearing a couple of weeks ago. There's some other policy proposals, and this kind of the Ethic Act, and there's just a bit of a Senate companion to it that would have the effect of putting some special rules on the patenting capability and enforcement mechanisms available to pharmaceutical companies, make it more difficult to obtain or enforce pharmaceutical related patents, maybe put a numerical, we are back to numbers, a numerical limit on, how many patents per product you as a company may be able to enforce. I mean, you've studied this and other proposals, as you've looked at it, both as a piece of legislation and kind of with the backdrop of all the understanding of the science and the economics, I mean, what's your sense of the consequences of proposals like this, both in terms of the innovation capability of our great companies and what the effect on patients may be, even further downstream as you look at it?
Yeah, so a lot to break down there. So
Unpacking is our theme, right?
yes, unpacking. So with regard to this idea of duplicative patents, and I think you mentioned this Ethic Act, again, not to go into the details, but this is a legislative proposal that's designed to get at what some people see as duplicative patenting. And yet, when you look at actually what's going on, they're not duplicative at all. So, as we've said, biopharmaceutical development takes a long time, right? So, anywhere from like 9 to 12 to 15 years on average, depending on what kind of drug you're talking about. Um, and this idea that people are somehow intentionally delaying all the innovations that are necessary to bring a drug to market are laughable because we all know, right, that you want an immediate return on your investment. You don't want your return on your investment to be 15 or 20 years down the line. And so the idea that people would necessarily delay these things is somewhat risible. But even then, as you're going through the process, not only are you having to come up with new inventions to address problems that you didn't foresee at the beginning, so the ones that we talked about with omeprazole and myrbetriq, but also as you're going through, you're realizing that there are certain variations of your drug, of certain embodiments is what we call them in the patent system of a drug that are actually going to be better and safer and more effective for patients to use. And so even though from a patent standpoint, right, patenting or getting extra claims on these seems like it's trivial or even duplicative, when you again look at the actual science, it turns out that these small differences are actually really important. And so, the patents, if you just look at the words in the patents, they may look duplicative, but they're not actually duplicative.
Yeah.
And then, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, 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 please finish.
And then to your bigger question about what the potential effect of things like the Ethic Act and a lot of the other legislative proposals that are kind of in the works right now, what would be the effect of all of these? Well, for a lot of them, they would, as you suggested, specifically weaken biopharmaceutical patent rights in a way that we don't see in any other patentable technology, which is itself somewhat ironic given that biopharmaceuticals are so heavily dependent on patent protections. And yet, that's the one technology or one areas of technology in which we see people really trying to weaken patent protections. And so this could lead to hurting biopharmaceutical innovation in the United States. We started this session off talking about how the United States has become a leader in biopharmaceutical innovation. And yet, what we're talking about now in terms of these legislative proposals really could undermine that, especially when you talk about all the proposals put together. Right? So single proposals may have a huge effect by themselves, but certainly put together in the aggregate it could have a huge deleterious effect on the industry. And I think what people don't realize is that patent protections are important, not so much because you want to recoup the investments that you've already made into developing a drug, but because the revenues that you make today really determine the kind of research and development dollars that you're able to invest the next year. So for the large biopharmaceutical companies who are by and large responsible for the heavy lifting necessary to introduce new biopharmaceutical products, they really have to look at the bottom line in terms of planning research and development for the next year. And so if we in some sort of concentrated way really try to rein in, as I'm sure the critics see it, rein in biopharmaceutical patents,
Mhm.
it's seen not only a retrenchment and reorientation away from the more cutting edge and yet more expensive and risky areas of biopharmaceutical research, but just an overall reduction in future research and development.
No, yeah, no, it all makes sense. One quick follow-up to that, Professor Schultz, putting on your law school cap here. Is there any other place in U.S. patent law where this has been done, where there's been, special kind of limiting factors or limiting rules placed on a category of patents, either how you can get them or how you can use them? Is that?
And No,
Okay.
no, except in the most obscure ways, like patents for inventions that need to be classified for national
Sure.
security. Other than that, we treat everything the same, and we try to, and because we want to encourage innovation. And here we have a policy of encouraging generic competition that started in the 80s with the Hatch-Waxman Act. And guess what? It worked. Um, we have the most robust generic market among our peers. 90% of our prescriptions are filled by generics. Among peer countries, countries with similar income, we have the cheapest generics. We have much higher generic utilization than most European countries. So we're doing something right. And one of the things that's happened is generics have the Hatch-Waxman Act eased the way with a number of provisions that make it easier to challenge innovator patents. And easier to follow on and copy innovator drugs. And yet, there's still this concept that somehow the generic industry is weak and easily thwarted, which is kind of absurd. These are big, multi-billion, many billion dollar publicly held companies that have big staffs of patent lawyers and scientists. And there's a huge advantage in that we give to the generic industry. For example, the first successful generic challenger, the first one that can invalidate the innovator's patent, gets 6 months where it's the only generic. What's so exciting about that? Well, essentially, what it creates is a market that's a duopoly with the innovator and the generic in it. It can be worth billions. And so these generic companies invest in these challenges. And just to show you the effect of this incentive, because incentives work, is back in the 80s. It was usually on average 19 years before the first innovator patent was challenged by a generic. Now it's 6 years after approval on average. So you've got basically 6 years as an innovator after your drug is approved before you start seeing challenges to your patents.
Yeah.
Um, so the system works. And they really don't need more advantages. They're doing really well, and they can fend for themselves. They're experts at this, and they make a really good business out of it.
Sophisticated companies in a sophisticated industry, right?
Yeah.
System just needs to support both ends of that. Just wanted to close. We've spent a good part of the time looking at some myths and criticisms and trying to provide some data and science to the reality of the discussion. I wanted to pivot. Let me start with you, Mark. You used the phrase "doing something right," so I wanted to kind of play on that theme. As you look at maybe even outside of the conversation we're having today, are there areas, are there things, specific things we collectively, the U.S. system could do to strengthen, particularly the patent system, the innovation ecosystem for all industries, not just life sciences, that you're tracking other pieces of legislation, other legislative initiatives or regulatory initiatives you're looking at? What could we do to make things even better from just a broad standpoint of using, helping the patent system support even more innovation across the board?
Sure. So we've talked about how effective the U.S. patent system is, but it's become less effective the last 20 years. The Supreme Court made injunctions harder to get. Then we changed the law. Congress changed the law to make patents easier to invalidate through the post-grant review. And then about 10 years ago, the Supreme Court had a quartet of cases that some people call the Four Horsemen that made it harder to get patents on a lot of important areas, including diagnostics and gene patents. And as a result, we've seen the proportion of venture capital going to biopharma startups reduce significantly as investors have moved toward other sectors. And we've seen companies walk away from really important areas of research, like, diagnostic tools. And so we really could fix the system. And so first, there's PARA is a proposed act that would restore eligibility and clarify the rules around eligibility, which are a mess. And that's just not critics saying that. That's judges who have to apply them have complained in their opinions that there is not sufficient guidance, and they've called on either Congress or the Supreme Court to clarify this area that has become so muddied. Para would do that, and that's really important. We could restore injunctions with the Restore Act. We could rein in post-grant review. These are all tools that are important, and they're important to our international competitiveness. We've got strong competitors like China coming on. China is not just a copyist anymore. China has invested in its IP system. It's the U.S. Chamber ranks it in terms of the effectiveness of its IP system, only 7 places below the U.S. now. Lots of venture capital investment is going to China. And these companies, we should not take our position of leadership for granted.
Those are three, more than three really good ones: para, injunctive, PTAB, injunctive relief, PTAB reform. Mark, you've given us maybe the foundations for a sequel to this panel today, where we can talk about some of those other legislative initiatives in addition to the topics that we covered today. So I wanted to close and thank you both, Emily and Mark, for taking the time, lending your expertise, not just to this discussion today, but over a long period of time. And again, unpackingip.org is a great resource for the research that Mark and Emily and their colleagues have been doing for a very long time. And there's a lot of real data, real analysis, and real research to be found there on the set of topics we discussed today and even more going into the future. So again, thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope the conversation was productive and impactful as you think about these topics going forward, and look forward to the opportunity to engage in the future. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chris.